Hello everyone, my name is Ben Karst and I will present a webinar on how to record macros today for everyone. Before we start, just like the screen says, make sure your sound is turned on, and if you want to ask any question, there's the Q&A window on your Zoom software where you can get in touch with me. We've got quite a lot of people on the course today, so I might not get to everyone's question on time, but I'll try my best to answer any outstanding questions at the end of the webinar. We will send you a cheat sheet and the recording after the webinar, and you should get that if you've registered for this course. Recording macros, what we'll be covering today is a general introduction to macros, how to record a basic macro, how to record macros using relative references, and how we can assign buttons and shortcuts to macros. And then finally, how we can save Excel files which contain macros on our computer. So it's just a basic introduction, but hopefully this should be quite useful for anyone who hasn't had a go at that previously. Our company, Woodside IT Solutions, provides courses all over the UK. So if you like what you see today, we can come directly on site to your company and deliver similar courses, like one-to-one or in a group session. We can provide laptops and equipment if you don't have that. And we can provide courses not only in Excel, which is the course we're delivering courses on today, but also in any of the applications you see on screen at the moment. So Access, Outlook, Word, pretty much any Microsoft applications that exist at the moment. So do get in touch if you want to have something similar on your site. We can also give you specific webinar training similar to the free webinar that you're getting today, but specifically tailored to your company. So if you want something similar delivered, just get in touch and we can do that for you. So macros, what they are, it's a little bit of a mystery for a lot of people what they actually signify. But it's basically just a fancy term for a very, very simple computer program. So macros don't just exist in Excel, in Microsoft. They exist in pretty much any other programming language as well. So you can have a Java macro, for instance, or an HTML macro, C++ macro. So if you've ever encountered any other programming languages and you build a very simple program with those, then that could be referred to as macros as well. But Microsoft have used that term more so than any sort of other company, which is why it's usually associated with Microsoft and specifically with Excel, because that's where most people build macros in. So like I say, it's nothing super fancy. Most software applications tend to be much more complex than the type of macros that people write in Excel. But as you'll be seeing today, they can be used to do some very, very simple steps that can automate a lot of processes in your spreadsheets, in your programs. The programming language that Microsoft uses specifically is called Visual Basic for applications. So people usually refer to that as VBA. So if you ever come across that term, again, it's just terminology, but VBA is effectively the programming language that you'll be using anytime you program or record a macro. So it's not something you have to really be aware of or know specifically, but sometimes if you're using macros, people want like Office might talk about VBA or Visual Basic for applications rather than macros. So like what they are referring to is mainly just the programming language that you are using as and when you record something in a macro. Print. So going into it, we've got an example file prepared in Excel where we're just going to analyze how we can do a very, very simple macro, and hopefully you'll all see the example file on the screen at the moment, where we've got a couple of names to the left-hand side, and we've got some employee codes after that. And the first macro that we want to build is something which effectively converts those names that you see here into a different format. So you might have encountered similar situations before. All I'm trying to do here is, you can see we've got some names here: Davis Lee, Melissa James, Sonia McCormick, and so on. And what I'm trying to achieve is I'm trying to get these names into a different format. I'm trying to, for the first name, instead of saying Davis Lee, I want to say D.Lead, and for the second person, I want to say m dot James, and so on and so forth. You can see there's something called flash fill in Excel, which can automatically do that for you if you've got one of the latest versions. The moment you started typing out a sequence, but usually, especially in the older versions, you'll have to manually convert that using a number of steps that we'll be going through later on ourselves. But the point of a macro is that rather than whichever way you use to do such a step, so you like whether you're doing that manually or with flash fill or any other way, it usually does require these type of problems require quite a few steps usually in Excel. And if that's something that you have to do on an ongoing basis, if that's something you have to do regularly, every Monday you get a list of names, and for whatever reason, maybe your client sends you a list of names, but they're not in the format that your company wants them in, then it's these type of processes that can waste a lot of time when you have to manually convert things like that on a regular basis. Even if you're using formulas, it can take a little bit of time to set these things up. So this would be a very good example of where a macro might come in handy, because what we're going to do with this macro is we're effectively going to record a program that records how we're going to convert these names from the original, Davis, Lee, Melissa, James, Sonia McCormick, from the full name into the abbreviation that we've seen on the screen earlier. So we're going to record pretty much every step that we've done, and what should happen is in the background we should get a program that records the programming of what we've done in such a way that we can use the same program going forward to automate that process every time we're using the same sort of scenario. So to record any macro, all you need to go do is click on the View tab in your Excel spreadsheet, and to the right-hand side, you should see a button that is called macros. And to record a macro, so like I say, the word macro literally just stands for a basic program. All you would need to do is click on Record Macro, and from the moment you press this button, it will open up another window where you effectively have to decide what you want to call this particular macro in terms of like the name that you want to provide. So because from that moment onwards, you effectively from that moment onwards, you effectively become a programmer, if you like. Even though you're not programming yourself, you're just recording something. But if you do it right, then you've effectively created a piece of software. So from the moment you record that, you can run that piece of software over and over again. So you just need to name that software whatever you want to name it at. So you can call it, let's call this convert names, and or whatever else you want to supply to that. You can then assign a keyboard shortcut to that. We'll look at how to do that later, and you can decide where to store that macro. Again, we'll look at some other examples where that is a little bit more obvious as well. Finally, you can give it a description, and this is really just for your own help. So if you have 5, 6, 7 or more macros, and you want to see specifically what each macro relates to, then you can write that in this screen here. And from the moment you click OK, then every single step that you do in your just so that I would get an extra column to display. Click here that says text to columns, and this is one of the many ways you could convert one type of data into another type of data. So what I've done before the webinar, I've clicked on delimited, then clicked on next here, and I've selected the option that says space, and then clicked on finish, and effectively what that does, it splits these names up into name and surname. Again, I'm not going to go through this too slowly today, because that's not the point of this webinar, but it's just to show you what I've done. If you're doing all of these steps while you're recording the macro, then anytime you're completing any one of these steps, the programming will be saved in the background so that you can say, you can use that over and over again. So this is how I got, the names to split up in the first place. I then did the same thing again. I inserted another line and highlighted all the remaining names once more. I've gone to the same option, text to columns, and as that came up, this time I've clicked on fixed with, and then on next, and The second time round, I basically just put an arrow after the first character and then clicked on finish, which effectively splits up the initials of the name and the remainder of the name into one column. At which point I've just deleted this column, and what we are remaining, what we've got at the end is one column that says the initials and one column that says the surnames. So it's just a number of steps that you can complete to convert the original full name that we've seen into these two building blocks. And finally, I've built a small formula that effectively converts those two building blocks into one text entry that is exactly in the format that we wanted it earlier. So I've said, give me the initial, the initial, and then concatenate this initial with the ampersand symbol, with the word full stop and a space. And then, I've concatenated it again with the surname of the name that we've split up. And the moment I've done that, it gives me the name in the exact same format that I want. So I can track that down, and I'm getting all the names in the right format to display on the computer screen. I can then copy those names, and on the home tab, I can click on paste special values in that first column, so that it copies all the names over into the original column that I want the names to be displayed. And then finally, so this is the final step. So I've got all the names exactly in the name that I want. So finally, I can delete all the extra piece of information that we used. That was just an intermediary step. So I can delete the final column if you like, and I can delete the middle column. And what I end up with is exactly the same two columns that I had before, but the original names are now converted into the names in the format that I want to display them in. So again, this seems like a lot of different steps. Like I say, if that was going too fast, by all means, pause that after the webinar. This is just a small example. There's lots of other examples I could have shown you. This is just something, a small process that if you have to do this every Wednesday, or even twice a month, it becomes a real pain to have to go through these steps multiple times. But what we can now do, so seeing that I've recorded all of these steps before the webinar using the same method that I showed you earlier, we can now run this program. Once you've recorded it once, you should be able to keep run this program over and over again. It's just going to do the same thing again and again to the data as we've got it. So if I just copy the original data over to this example file, so that we've got the data exactly in the same format as we've had it earlier, then what you can do is, after you've recorded a macro, you can go onto the View tab, and on the View tab, you can once again click on this macros button, and on this macros button, you can, early on we clicked on record macro, but this time you can click on view macro. So the moment you've finished recording a macro, you click on this view macros button, and it'll show you all the different macros that you've recorded. So one of them is the convert names macro that we've just recorded earlier. So you see there's a couple of other macros there. These are also examples that I've set up, and we'll look at them shortly. But this convert names macro is basically a macro that I recorded using the exact same steps that I've just gone through. And what should happen is, now that I've created this program, the program should do the exact same steps that I've done, but automatically, meaning that the moment I click on this name, convert names macro, and click on run, then it should go through all of these names and convert them using all of the steps that we've just done. So hopefully, if I click on run here, you can see that from one moment to the other, it just seems to jump from the original data to the result. But really, what it's done, and it happens so fast you can't really see it. It's done all these intermediary steps. It's used text to column twice. It's written this formula automatically, then deleted all the intermediary steps. So all you see is the end result, but it's actually gone through all of these things manually. So this is the real power of these macros, because if you have a process that takes half an hour, you can record this entire process and run the macro once, and you effectively save yourself half an hour. If the process takes an hour, 2 hours, and so on, then you create more and more time savings just by recording a macro rather than having to do this all manually. Like I said, the actual programming language that you are using when you're recording these macros is called VBA. you don't have to majorly know much about that if recording macros is the main thing that you're interested in. But if you're ever interested in where that is actually being saved, then if you press Alt and F11 in your Excel spreadsheet, so it's the key Alt, and at the same time you're pressing the key F11, then what you get is you get a window appearing, which is basically the background. It's called a VB editor. It's the background of Excel. The same thing works in Word or in Outlook or PowerPoint, where all the programming is being saved on. So it looks a little bit funny. Like I say, I'm just gonna very quickly show you this. It's not you don't have to know much about this if you're just starting out on macOS. But in this editor, basically, which looks a little bit crazy, you should see a section to the left-hand side which says modules. If you click on this modules group and then double click on module 1, then you should be able to see. You can see here, right away, there's a macro called convert names, which is the macro that we've recorded. And, without knowing anything about this programming language, this is effectively all the different commands that the program has automatically created for you. So if you were a programmer, you could write all of these commands out manually, and the program would do exactly the same thing as the program did that we recorded. But the key benefit of recording a macro is that you need to know very, very little about how this works and what this does. You can see there's quite a lot of commands until you get to the end. But effectively, all of these commands are basically just the programming commands that we need to complete the program in the way that we've recorded it earlier. So just by recording, the program will automatically write all of this in the background. And you don't need to know much about that unless you want to get even more into it. If the moment you like macros and you like what you're seeing today and it helps you, then it is a good idea to start learning the programming language, even just a little bit, so that you can maybe decipher something. If it goes wrong, repair it, or make it much more advanced, because the macros that we can record in Excel, they like we said earlier, and this is why macro just stands for simple program. Macros that you can record can only be very simple things. They can't make decisions. They can't do loops. If you've heard of programming loops, they can't leave the application. So you can't record something in Excel that automatically sends an email to someone, or these type of things aren't possible unless you learn how to actually program the language, which means you can do much more, like a lot more powerful things with it. So programming is sort of the ultimate tool that you have to really automate almost anything in Excel. But recording a macro, the topic that we're looking at today, is basically as close to that as you can get in that scenario. Are there any questions so far? I think I've got one question. So someone's asking if they can rebook the session for tomorrow if the headphones aren't working. So this is just a one-off free webinar today. But if you have registered for the course, then you will get the video sent to you. So if you missed the course or you have to drop out for whatever reason, then you will get the video sent to you afterwards, so you can get through that. But obviously, you lose the opportunity to ask any questions live. So, unfortunately, we won't do a repeat of that. But if it's a very popular, if the topic if you guys find that topic very useful, then do get in touch and do give us the feedback, and we'll try and do more advanced topics or similar topics like that in the future. Cool. So the main thing that you have to watch out for when you're recording macros is there's a lot of sort of paranoia in the world in general around macros, because quite a lot of people don't understand what they are. It's programming that like you've just seen, the thing that goes on in the program in the background. It's a bit of a mystery to a lot of people. Like we said, you can do some very, very powerful things with it, but people who can't program can obviously do some damage with that as well. So there have been situations where people have built viruses with macros, and or hacked passwords and things like that. So as well as it being really powerful, it's a little bit dangerous as well, depending on who uses it and how much you accept from sort of untrusted sources. But as a result, there's quite a lot of sort of security measures in Excel around using macros. One of them being that if you record a macro or program a macro, basically if you just have a macro in any file, then you can't just save your Excel spreadsheet in the way that you would normally save it. You need to click on File, and instead of just clicking on save like you normally would, you need to click on save as. And if you click on save as, then when that standard screen appears, you need to unfortunately, instead of just selecting Excel workbook. So normally most files that you'll have saved in the past will have been an Excel workbook, but in order for macro to work, so once you've recorded a macro, in order for that to work, you need to save it as an Excel macro-enabled workbook. So only if you save it as an Excel macro-enabled workbook will you be able to use that subsequently. So there's another question there. Someone, Dan, is asking, if you're recording a macro, can you do it across two different workbooks, or is it only possible to record the steps in the workbook you just you start the recording in? This is actually something we'll get to in a second. It's a very good question because by default, any by default any macro that you could record is going to be just saved in the particular workbook that you're working on at the moment. So by default, you can only use a macro in the particular workbook that you're working on in a second. But in a, like that you're working on it at the moment. But in a second, we'll see one way of how you can sort of roll that out to any other workbook that you're using. So we'll come across a way in a couple of minutes where that is possible. But by as a standard thing, if you are recording a macro in a certain workbook, then that macro attaches itself to the specific workbook that you're working on, and only if you recycle that file subsequently, that's when you can use that macro effectively. But the way people do it, so imagine I've got this macro here that I use to convert names. So rather than creating 20 different files with 20 different name lists to convert them, like the way people would do this is the file which contains all the macros, they would just set that up as a sort of template and then copy and paste the new data into this macro in this workbook which contains the macros that they want to run, and then once the macros have done all the workarounds that you want to, then you can always copy and paste the final data into a final workbook if you want to have that in a different workbook, or you can obviously save that macro workbook under a different name. So this is usually the way people do it. They use sort of a template which contains all the macros, and then once they've done whatever they want to do, then they use that data to copy and paste that somewhere else or save it down somewhere else. But by default, you have to work in the same file. So that's a very good question. So a macro attaches itself to the workbook that you're working on. If you are programming, however, if you learn how to program, then you can learn how to direct any other application from any application using VBA. So if you learn how to program recording a macro, you have to unfortunately pretty much stay within the same workbook. If you're learning how to record them, like how to program a macro, then you can program something where, for instance, the current workbook can automatically open up another workbook, or can open up even a PowerPoint presentation or things like that. So if you learn how to program, then you're completely independent of the file that you're currently in. But if you're not programming, then normally you're limited to the workbook that you're currently using. But we'll see one method of where that is slightly different. Cool. So, like I say, by default, this is sort of what we're getting. The one thing that you can do as well that people like to use sometimes is creating a button where you can run the macro directly from a button, because as we've seen earlier, in order to run that macro, every time you have to click on this macros arrow, then click on few macros, and then select the specific macro that we want, and then click on run, which can be again quite a couple of steps, especially if you don't remember which macro it was. If you didn't give it a very good name, then it's quite annoying to have to do these steps every single time. So what you can do instead, and you see on top of my screen, I've got a tab called the developer tab. You might not have this developer tab by default. If you don't see this developer tab, the developer tab is basically a tab that is specifically related to macros. So you can see, normally people have the home tab, the insert tab, page layer tab, and so on. But if you some people have this developer tab. If you don't have it, it's a tab specifically related to macros. Then what you need to do is you need to go with your cursor somewhere to the right hand side of any ribbon where there's some blank space, and right click on that ribbon and then click on customize the ribbon. And if you click on customize the ribbon, then you'll get a window to appear, where you can basically set how you want to display your ribbon. How many options do you want to display? So you can see here to the right hand side, there's basically a couple of tabs being displayed. Every time it says a tick, then you're displaying that tab. Every time it doesn't say a tick, then you're not displaying the tab. So if I get rid of the home tab, then it's not going to show up anymore. So for a lot of people, by default, the developer tab will be unticked. So if you want to see the developer tab, you just have to tick it in this window and then click OK. But then the moment you do that, you should get this tab up here that says developer tab. And on this developer tab, you get a lot of options to do with macros. Like I say, today is just an introduction, so we're not going to these through all of these. But there's one thing that I'd like to show you here, which is in the middle of that screen. You see a button that says Insert. If you click this Insert button, then there's a lot of options that come up. One of them under Form Control, in fact, the very, very first button says Button. And if you click on this and then just drag that somewhere onto your Excel spreadsheet, then it opens up the same window we saw earlier to edit macro, to choose the macro that you want. And if I click on Convert Names here and then click OK, then I'm assigning that macro to the button that I've just created. So the moment I click OK, I now have a button in place that effectively will run that macro every time I click on it. So if I do the same thing we did earlier, if I just get my original data back, and the same thing will work for like any other data. So obviously the point would be that you're running this process multiple times when something changes. So imagine the list changes, or we're getting different names, maybe maybe some of these names change, and you want to use this macro over and over again. Then the trick would be that every time you're effectively clicking this button, it's running that macro. So you don't even have to go into view, select the macro. You just have to click on the button, and it's going to do all of these steps in one go. You can see it doesn't matter what you've done previously. It just whatever data you've got, it converts that automatically every time you click that button. So if you set up a button, it's something that quite a lot of people like to do, because then you can even roll out a file to someone who has no understanding of recording macros, or even very limited understanding of how Excel works in general. Because the moment you click set up a couple of macros and then assign them to certain buttons, then you can just tell someone to basically click the button, and they don't have to know what it does or how it works. They just have to be able to click on this, and then it runs the macro subsequently. So that is one of the good tools in the developer tab that you might come across that would be quite helpful. Print. So I'll show you a very, very simple example, just to actually run through an entire macro process, how we're recording that, and how we can access that subsequently. And this is coming back to the question I've tried to answer 10 minutes ago, where the question was, is there a way to record the macro that is available in other workbooks as well? Well, what you can't do, you can't set up a macro specifically for just 2 or 3 workbooks, but not for others. You can only set up a macro that is either available in just one workbook, or you can set it in such a way that it's available in every single workbook that you have effectively. And the way you would do this is you would click on the View tab again, and run through the same process again. So let's do that again. If I click on macros and then click on Record Macro, then where it says macro name, this time I'm going to give it a simple name. Let's just call it clear data. And what I'm trying to do, this is really simple. It's just to illustrate this process. I'm just trying to clear the data that you see on the screen every time I press this macro. So it's something, you might want to record a lot more steps, but it's really just to illustrate what you can do with this. So early on, we saved it in this workbook, which means it's only attached itself to this particular workbook. But if you change this drop down to something called a personal macro workbook, then the moment you select personal macro workbook and then click OK, then anything that you will be recorded will attach itself to something called a personal macro workbook, which is something that you always have in the background of every Excel spreadsheet. So by recording it in that manner, you should have that macro available in every single spreadsheet. So the personal workbook is almost like a template that applies itself to any subsequent like any workbook that you might open. So if I just go through a couple of steps again, if I select the entire data that we've got, and then on the home tab I'm going to click on clear, and I'm going to click on clear all, and I'm literally just going to delete the data that I've got on my screen at the moment. Then to finish recording that macro, I can either go to the View tab again and then click on to macros. And where it said record the macro earlier, it should now say stop recording. Or similarly, on the left bottom corner, you should get the same button. So whichever button you use, the moment you click stop recording, it's going to finish recording what we've done, and it's saved that macro. But this time, instead of saving it into this particular workbook, it saved itself into the personal workbook, meaning that we should have that available in any subsequent workbook that we're using. So just to illustrate this, if I just type in any data now into my spreadsheet, then I should be able to click on macros again, click on view macros, and there's now one called clear data, but you can see it's called personal XLSB clear data, meaning that it's something that is in the personal workbook, which means it's accessible everywhere in every Excel application that we're opening. So the moment I click run here, you can see it's clearing all the data from my screen. And the same thing will work in any other Excel workbook as well. If it's the first time you're running something for the personal workbook and you don't have that available, so the personal workbook, like I say, is something that is in every single Excel. But the first time, if you use it for the first time, it's hidden by default. So in order to access that, like to be able to record something onto the personal workbook, the very first time, you might have to go onto the View tab, and then in the middle where it says Unhide, if you click on Unhide and then select Unhide, personal workbook, and then click OK, then you can make that workbook that is always in the background appear effectively. And by making it appear, you can then start recording onto that workbook. You only have to do that the very first time you do it. Subsequently, it'll automatically be generated every time you use Excel. So that is the one way you can make a macro attach itself to every single workbook that you're using. Cool. The final thing I'll show you guys with respect to macros is we can record a macro with the exact same way we've just done it there, or we can use something called relative references, and it's a little bit abstract initially, but we'll just go through how that works. What I've done before the webinar, again, I've just recorded a macro, and I've recorded a macro where someone's trying to approve something. So you might come across these situations as well, where maybe your manager is trying to approve certain products or certain processes, and every time they want to approve something, they want to build effectively something which says approved in one box, and then in the next box they want to have the date displayed. So a very quick keyboard shortcut to display the date is pressing Control and semicolon at the same time. If you press Control and semicolon, it's going to enter the date into your cell. Then maybe they want the timestamp as well. A very quick keyboard shortcut to do that is pressing Control Shift and colon. In which case you're getting the date and the time as and when that was approved. So it's one of the standard things that people have to do quite a lot. They want to approve some things, and then they want to have a date and a timestamp as and when they've approved that. So rather than going through these steps that I've just done there, as simple as that is, but it's still it's still 3 or 4 steps that you have to do. So while I was doing that earlier before I started this webinar, it's basically just recorded a macro that did exactly these steps that we've done there. And if I go into View macros, I've called that approval standard. So if I click on run here, then you can see it just automatically does that. Anytime I run that program, it's going to just basically approve something and give me a date and a timestamp every time I click on this. But what we can do as well, and this is even better in some ways, it's even better than using a button. When we start to record a macro in that first screen, you can see something here which is called shortcut key, and it says Control plus, and then there's a little box here. So while you're before you even set up a macro, you can basically assign a keyboard shortcut to this macro, so that when you press that keyboard shortcut in the future, then the macro will be automatically run. So what I've done earlier, I've assigned the keyboard shortcut Control S to the macro that I recorded. So I don't even have to go into macros, click on View macros, click on that particular macro that I've recorded. I can just press Control S, and then it automatically runs that macro, and I don't have to do that again. So that's an even quicker way of accessing that. If you want to see what the keyboard shortcut was subsequently, or you want to change it, then what you can do is you can click on macros, click on view macros, and then travel to the macro that you want to change. So in this case, it's my approval standard macro. And in here, if you click on options, then you can see what keyboard shortcut you assigned earlier, which was Control plus S, and you can change that to any other keyboard shortcut subsequently, so that you're running that subsequently. So that's all very good. But as you've noticed, wherever I am in the screen, if I click Control S, it's always going to say approved, and the date and the timestamp, which is good. It's always going to say that in cell A3, in cell B3, and in cell C3, wherever I am in my spreadsheet, which might be okay in some instances, but sometimes you might want to have that displayed wherever your cursor is. So imagine you've got product A here, product B here, product C here, product D here, and so on, and the list could go on forever. And you might want to, like the manager might want to go through this list and say, okay, I'm approving this one here, so I'm approving this one here, but B isn't good enough, they need to review that again, then I'm approving this one here, and so on and so forth. So if you want to go through a list and just approve one after the other, then what we've just done wouldn't be good enough, because every time I click this macro, it's going to just type approved into cell A3 rather than the relevant line that we want that message to be shown. So the trick to make that automatically change wherever your cursor is being displayed is, before you record the macro, there's a button on the very bottom of that option that says use relative references. If you switch and you see a massive text that basically gives you in the preview, that gives you a little bit of a reference of how that works. But if you click on this button, if you click on use relative references, and then you click on record macro, then the difference is that everything that you're recording subsequently will be recorded in relative steps, meaning that it's not just going to do that in the same place over and over again, but it's going to do that with respect to where you've clicked on in the screen. So if you switch this on, I can show you the difference. So the one I've recorded is called approval relative references. So I've done the exact same thing before the webinar that we've just done here, but I've switched on relative references before I've done that. And if you do that, then it means wherever your cursor is, it's going to do the steps that you've done earlier. So if I go into the first one and click my keyboard shortcut, then it's going to say approved. It's going to say the timestamp. It's going to say the date. But if I now go into another one, then rather than always going to the same place, depending on where my cursor is, if I go and press my keyboard shortcut here, then it's going to say approved here. If I press it here, it's going to say approved here. So it's a way where you can automate you can not only automate the process, but you can also make it go to a different place every single time you are accessing that with relative to the position of your cursor. So that's what this use relative references mean. Every time you switch this on, it's going to run the macro according to the position of your cursor. If you switch this off, then it's going to run the macro, but it's always going to do it in the exact same place that you've used to record the macro in at the start of this. Any questions so far? Is that sort of clear for everyone? I know there's a lot to it. It's a little bit of an introduction today, but please do feel free to ask any question via the Q&A window, and I'll try and get back to you. But hopefully this was useful to some of you guys. Like I say, if you have more questions after the webinar, or if you find this topic quite useful, just let us know, and we can do some more advanced sessions on this in the future. But hopefully this serves as an introduction into what macros do, how they work, and you can start using them a little bit more in the future. One thing I would say before we finish this webinar is that like I said earlier, there's a little bit of a paranoia in terms of using macros, because you can do some damage with that as well. So if you are using that in your company, you might have to be aware of the sort of company policy around macros. There's some companies that forbid macros altogether, whereas some companies only allow specific types of macros. So before you start sort of programming things or recording things, you might want to only do this if you have approval from your manager. Similarly, if you're sending macros to a client, if you've done something that saves a lot of time and you're sending that outside of your firm, then your client might have a company policy in place that automatically deletes your email. Like if it comes attached with a macro. So that's something you have to be aware of. But other than that, it hopefully should be very useful and save you guys a lot of time. There's one question there which says, can a macro be changed into a graph with info? I'm not 100% sure I'm fully understanding that question, but like if you're sort of asking if we can apply macros to graphs as well, then that is absolutely possible. So anything to do with graphs. So if you're wanting to create a graph or update a graph or change a graph, or move a graph somewhere else, then all of that can be done via a macro as well. So anything that you normally do with graphs in a spreadsheet, you can just record the macro before you're doing that, and it should automatically do that for you. Not quite sure that's what you were asking there, but just let me know if that doesn't answer your question. We've got a few more questions. So James is asking, will this tutorial be sent over to us afterwards? Yes, absolutely. So you will get a live recording of what we've done today. So you can pause that video and go through that again if you didn't quite catch certain things, because I know we had to go through some of them a little bit quicker. And Sarah is asking whether the macro that we just basically recorded, where we recorded a macro that said approved, and then there was a date stamp and a time stamp. So if you're doing this, Sarah's asking whether that display date and time will be updated each time you use it. It depends, like what you mean by that. So basically, every time you run the macro, there'll be a new time and date stamp as of the time that you use it. So that's absolutely correct. So if I run this now, so earlier I ran it at 7:32. So if I think the time is a little bit off there, but if I run this now, then you should see. I think this is just a problem with the way that's been formatted. But yeah, normally, I think that's just my computer issues. Apologies. But normally, you will see this absolutely update every time you run the macro. So every time you run the macro, the time and date will update. But if you sort of close the spreadsheet and you come into it, so any existing timestamp that won't get updated. It's only the new macros that you send that you access will get updated subsequently. Cool. I'll just stop here. If there are other questions, I'll answer them by text. But yeah, thanks very much for your attendance today, and hope this was useful for you guys. And we'll probably see each other again in the future. So thanks very much.